Not right. Oops, second. That's not right. Give me 1 second. Okay, I'm good. Okay, so welcome to our webinar tonight on COVID and aortic conditions. We're really going to be reviewing the latest research and information about vaccines and answering your questions. You know, COVID has been disrupting our lives since last March. Hard to believe. We had our first webinar about COVID and Marfan and related conditions. Enid was on it back in March 2020, and so little was known about the condition, how to treat it. You know, nobody had any ideas. We really tried to do the best that we can. Our doctors really stepped up to the plate and shared the knowledge they had. But since then, there's been a great deal of research on the virus and various treatments. And as you know, there are 2 vaccines available in the US, or if they're approved in the US, available is probably another issue. But we have two vaccines now. But you know, the more we know, it seems like the more questions we have. And so tonight we wanted to share the research related to COVID that affects our community of people with Marfan, Loeys-Dietz, and VEDS, and answer your questions, particularly about the vaccine. So before we introduce our speakers, I wanted to ask Michael Weimer, our President and CEO, to say a few words.
Great, thanks, Eileen. Hi, everybody. It's nice to be back, kicking off 2021. We're very excited with the series of webinars that are coming up, and I'm sure Eileen and others will chat about those tonight. We have a great evening planned. We have 2 wonderful physicians, and we also have Joe Grima, our Chief Science Officer from the Foundation as part of the program tonight. More on that to follow. We also have lots of webinars coming up, lots of events that are planned between now and the spring. We will be working on and having a virtual conference this coming summer. Annual conference will be virtual, and we'll start to probably have information out on that in the next month. We're also planning next year to be back in person in Newport Beach, California at Hogue. So if you like the in-person conferences, which I know many of you do, we plan on being in Southern California next July. Coming up, we have 26 Walk for Victory events between now and June 30th. We hope that many of those events will be live. We have 5 Heartworks events, including several new cities, Houston and Nashville. So if you happen to be in those areas, stay tuned. We have a great event next Thursday night. We have our first virtual wine event. And I feel like I'm on public television or something. But if you're looking for a way to really be with 100 other people in a virtual setting, sip some great wines, have some cheese in some cases, depending on the category you select, you should look up Uncorked, UNCORKED. And maybe Helene will put up the information in the chat box. And the key is by tomorrow, you need to sign up so we can guarantee that we'll be able to ship wine in time for the event next Thursday night. So good, fun social activity if you might like to do that. Our research program right now is in the process of being refreshed. We think there'll be most likely some significant changes to the types and the kind and the way we fund research going forward. That program will probably roll out July 1 of this year. And we're also going to be launching a brand new website, probably sometime during March. So watch for the new rendition of the Marfan website. So lots of things going on. It's a wonderful time to be part of the foundation. We love the active participants, and we've had so many, you know, back in E3, I saw some people mention that. We had over 3,000 people register for E3, largest event in the history of the foundation. We also had the Aortic Summit. And as you may know, the foundation not only includes Marfan, but today it includes the Loeys-Dietz Foundation, the VEDS movement, the Stickler involved people, sticklerdoc.org, and the GenTAC Alliance, which is a science arm division of the foundation. So with that, I will turn it over to the experts, but thank you for being here. Happy New Year. Don't ever hesitate to reach out, and I look forward to tonight. So Eileen.
Thank you, Michael. And now, without further ado, let me officially introduce our speakers tonight. We have Dr. Kim Eel, who is cardiologist from the Frankel Cardiovascular Center at the University of Michigan. Kim is also the chair of the Gentech Alliance and an advisor to our board of directors. Dr. Enid Nepture, pulmonologist from Johns Hopkins, who is a longtime member of our professional advisory board. I have to say, one of our most popular webinar speakers. She always draws a big crowd. And Dr. Josephine Grima, who is our chief science officer, as Michael said, and she's been with the foundation 20 years or more, we at least count. We have 3 great speakers for you tonight. Again, if you have questions tonight, put them in the chat box. I would actually recommend wait until after the presentation to put your questions in there, because it's very likely that they will be answered. But of course, if they're not, put them in the chat box, in the Q&A box. You don't need to raise your hand. I see some people raising their hand already. You don't need to do that. Just put your questions for the speakers about this topic in the Q&A. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing, shut off my video, and give it over to Josephine. Let me shut myself off first. And
Can you see my screen yet?
yes, you just need to put it on start from the beginning.
Okay. So
Great.
thanks everybody for joining us. I see that we have over 200 people here today. And so I want to just begin by going over what we're going to try to cover today. We tried to look at all the questions that came in. Many of them were similar, so we grouped them into these possible topics to discuss. So we'll be looking again to review the list of high-risk indications for severe outcomes if you get COVID. We're also going to be talking about what medications, would put somebody at a higher risk, or if that is actually true, because there was a lot of questions about ACE inhibitors and ARBs possibly doing that in the beginning, but now studies have been done and we really have answers to that. We're going to provide you with information about the vaccine. How is this mRNA virus different from others? Is it safe? What happens if you have allergies? Does it affect the vaccine's effect? Who should take the vaccine, and some information on the rollout. We'll also be looking to give you just a brief update on COVID-19 testing. And if you happen to get COVID, what the current drugs are available to treat those, to treat COVID. So to get started, let's tackle the question about who is at high risk of bad outcomes if they get COVID-19. So having Marfan, LDS, or VEDS, or most of the other genetic aortic conditions really doesn't put you at a higher risk for a bad outcome with COVID-19. However, there are those high risk categories that may put you at a higher risk, and those that is if you have certain lung conditions. And so Enid Nepture is our pulmonologist, and she's going to go over some of these lung conditions listed here briefly.
Great, thank you, Joe. And so the important point to understand in terms of which lung conditions place you at a high risk is the idea of pulmonary reserve, or the reserve in your breathing capacity that you have. And most people who don't have any underlying lung disease have what we call a great deal of pulmonary reserve. And that means that if you get like a pneumonia, or you get some major allergic reaction, or you have some inhaled toxic exposure, that you may get somewhat symptomatic, but you're not going to be so compromised that you wind up needing to be hospitalized, or you need supplemental oxygen, or you need to have ICU care, or at the most extreme, you need to be placed on a ventilator. So the conditions that we're listing here are those underlying conditions that may or may not be related to the Marfan, Loeys-Dietz, VEDS, or other disorders, but that reduce your underlying pulmonary reserve. And those include first restrictive lung disease. And this reflects a reduced capacity to take a deep breath in. And it's usually revealed on pulmonary function testing. And we see this in patients who have severe scoliosis or severe pectus deformities. And this is not something that would be reflected in mild impairment on pulmonary function testing, but very significant impairment. Emphysema is what we often see in patients who have neonatal Marfan syndrome, in which you have deterioration of the tissue in the lungs, which can result in kind of large holes or what we call bulla or blebs in the lungs. And this again will reduce the overall lung tissue and therefore will reduce your pulmonary reserve. A significant number of our patients also have coexistent asthma, especially those with Loeys-Dietz. But the type of asthma that we're concerned about and that places you in a high-risk group is asthma that requires chronic medication, where you have to use an inhaler every day, or you have to use what we call systemic steroids or steroid pills on a frequent basis. And lastly, if you've had asthma flares that require hospitalization, that puts you in a high-risk asthma group. COPD, either caused by chronic smoking, history of smoking, or that's an extension of underlying Marfan syndrome or other disorders, that also places you at high risk. Now, respiratory insufficiency can reflect any or all of these conditions if severe enough, and often will reflect the combination of these different conditions. And lastly, recurrent pneumothoraces. And that's because, as I tell all my patients with pneumothoraces, is that when you have each event, you lose some pulmonary tissue that can be replaced by scar. So with a number of these types of events, you're losing the reserve that we talked about, and that's what places you at a higher risk if you have a COVID-19 infection.
Great, thanks so much. So now we're going to call upon Dr. Kim Eagle, our cardiologist here, to go over some of the cardiovascular issues that may put you at high risk. Kim?
Thank you, Joe. And it's a delight for me to have the chance to be part of this webinar tonight and to be involved in teaching about COVID and the heart and the aorta. You know, I've been involved in aortic research for 37 years. I've never encountered in my lifetime a foe like COVID, with all of the uncertainty that we've had about the virus and what its effects might be. And remarkably, almost a year later from kind of the discovery, it's dramatic how much we've learned. Yet there's still so much that we don't know. And many of you will ask very specific questions unique to you or your family that we'll try the best we can to answer, but may not yet be known based on the science that we have. Much like Enid said, currently the data would suggest that the type of heart disease that might make you at risk for a more severe outcome with COVID infection has to do with reserve. And so if you have significant aortic valve regurgitation or mitral valve regurgitation, severe enough to be causing a problem, that is congestion or the need to take medications to try to deal with that, then that probably is a patient who, under the stress of COVID, would have a higher risk of a complication. Similarly, patients who have heart failure, either from a weak heart muscle or potentially a stiff heart muscle, these would be patients who are thought to be at higher risk to handle a more serious COVID infection. Hypertension also appears to be a marker of risk. And of course, many of these patients have developed a thickening of the heart muscle and or perhaps some degree of kidney function abnormalities related to hypertension. And both of those would make a person with a more severe infection at higher risk for a complication. There's some evidence perhaps that a unique group of patients with ACTA2 mutations, that would be children and young adults with alterations in the arginine 179 might be affected. And this is a group that have smooth muscle dysfunction syndrome. I want to make sure you notice that there's no line here for aortopathy. We do not currently believe that genetic aortopathy represents a very high risk condition. And there's been speculation that the kind of inflammatory response we see from COVID might rev up a genetic aortopathy, but we're not seeing that in the literature. And in fact, Joe sent out to our scientific advisory group, what has been your experience with patients that you've been following in your clinics with COVID? And we've not seen a signal of great concern that an aorta is going to expand or dissect in the midst of COVID. I have a 93-year-old physician who I care for who has an aortopathy, and he sailed through a COVID infection. His aorta did not grow, it did not tear. So I think I'm heartened to say, at least right now, and there have been tens of thousands of patients studied, we've not seen a signal that would make younger patients with genetic aortopathy a particularly high-risk condition. Joe?
Great, thanks so much. Several of our other genetic aortic conditions do have other issues that may put them at a higher risk. So Enid, do you want to go over that? I think some of these are pretty much from Loeys-Dietz and maybe VEDS type patients.
Yeah, and it's very important for everyone to recognize that when you're fighting off any serious infection, especially a serious pneumonia, that your ability to tolerate it reflects your overall health. And so many of these disorders that we're listing on this slide will compromise your ability to handle any type of infection. And so we can extend that actually to COVID. And so obviously chronic malnutrition. And that would be a setting in which there's an active and a long-term discussion about supplements and maybe the use of feeding tubes and supplements to your kind of regular diet. And that obviously will compromise your overall health and your ability to handle an infection. Inflammatory bowel disease requiring the use of immunosuppressants. So immunosuppressants make patients much more susceptible to a variety of pathogens, including viruses. And so that's why this is a setting in which you'd be much more susceptible to the effects of COVID. Other diseases requiring the chronic use of steroids, which are considered immunosuppressives, or other immunosuppressive drugs. And so there's a wide range of drugs that are considered immunosuppressives. And what you need to do is ask your physicians whether you are actually taking drugs that can suppress your immune system. And they can also give you a sense of whether the level of suppression is significant enough that you have to be concerned about COVID. And lastly, we suspect that people with VEDS who have experienced coughing up blood during lung hemorrhage are at higher risk of pulmonary complications. And that's because of what we know about VEDS, that the patients who have hemoptysis or lung hemorrhage usually have lesions in their lungs that don't necessarily repair themselves. And what we see are large cysts, or we see scars that form. And again, overall, that reduces the functional lung tissue, and therefore your lung reserve is compromised.
Great, thank you. So when we just started to learn about the mechanism of COVID-19, it involved the angiotensin receptor pathway. And since many of our patients do take these drugs, there was a thought that maybe it may put patients at higher risk. Or may protect them. We really didn't know. And now studies have been done to confirm the results of these. And so, Kim, do you want to go over this?
Yes, thank you, Joe. Obviously, for many of our patients with genetic aortic disease, this was a real concern. And early on, it was discovered that the virus can enter the lungs through the spike protein and shares a receptor with at least the ACE inhibitors and maybe the ARBs. And there was a small study, as I recall, out of Europe suggesting that maybe viral shedding was longer in people who were on ACE inhibitors. And this prompted a huge outcry about what's the risk. Much later now, we've got almost a year of data suggesting that there is no apparent signal that these drugs, ACE inhibitors, ARBs, the beta blockers, the calcium blockers, the diuretics that we use, they do not appear to confer a higher risk of developing severe complications of COVID-19. And in fact, there are a couple of observational studies that raise the question whether if you're hospitalized with COVID-19, being on an ACE or an ARB actually could be associated with a lower risk of mortality. So this is a very important finding, and we don't want patients to worry about the drugs they're on for their aorta. They do not appear to be interacting with COVID infections in a way that puts you at risk. There's also been a lot of talk about the coagulation that gets turned on by the COVID-19 virus in some patients. And we actually want our patients who are on blood thinners to continue those to reduce the risk of coagulation and clotting. So patients who have genetic aortopathy should continue on the medications that they've been given that are evidence-based, that appear to reduce the chance that they're going to develop an enlarged aorta or a tear in the aorta or hypertension, for example. And thankfully, the science, I think, now on this topic is very solid, Joe.
Right, great, thank you. So as Dr. Eagle had said, we had asked, one of the major questions that we got were, is there any data about Marfan and related conditions patients having COVID-19 and what were the outcomes? So although there's no evidence-based data, we did ask some of our PAB members about their patients. And Enid, do you want to just go over what we heard from them?
Yeah, so we queried our PAB, and several of us have had patients with Marfan, Loeys-Dietz who have developed COVID, but the overall impression was that these patients required very, very few hospitalizations. And there was only one death, and that death was related to an underlying condition of chronic lung disease. And so our impression, and this is not based on the kind of data that we would consider evidence-based, but is that there's not a strong signal that patients who have these disorders are at higher risk of adverse consequences if they in fact become infected. But it's very important that our patients recognize that those groups of disorders and comorbidities and issues that place them at higher risk are important to document and important to observe as they consider their candidacy for early vaccination.
Great, thank you. Now we're going to change over to the vaccine information. And Edith, maybe you can go over, how is this mRNA vaccine different from other vaccines?
Yeah, this has actually been a major advance in vaccine technology. And when it was first proposed to be used in COVID, there was a great deal of skepticism as to whether it would work. And the reason people were highly skeptical is that mRNA is known to be kind of highly fragile and relatively unstable kind of in blood. So it wasn't clear that one could stabilize RNA such that it could be taken up in a cell. And when that was actually achieved, then the possibilities were very, very interesting. So the way that this works is that the strategy for vaccines have historically been to introduce proteins that the virus makes into the blood so that the immune cells will recognize the protein, generate an immune response to it, and kind of register what we would call a durable immune response, so that if you're challenged later, you will not have the severe kind of outcomes that one could have with any of these respiratory viruses. And so the permutation of mRNA vaccines is that you don't have to actually introduce the protein into the blood. You let the cells do all the work in terms of making the protein. So what you actually introduce is the blueprint for making the protein, and that's the RNA sequence. And because, as I said, the RNA is typically relatively unstable, one coats it in a lipid or in a fat, and in a fat kind of coating that's very efficiently taken up by cells. So when you inject kind of this lipid-coated RNA into the blood and into the patients, it's ultimately taken up by a variety of cells. And the cells will actually make the spike protein that is coated by the RNA. And the spike protein is produced on the surface of the cell and also is released into the bloodstream, where it generates a very robust immune response. Now, the advantage of the RNA vaccine is that you produce orders of magnitude more proteins in order to engage the immune response. And also that you don't have to worry about kind of the protein being introduced kind of into the body and possible issues that one can have with those types of vectors. So it's incredibly efficient. So what have the results been with the vaccines that we've had so far? The first two FDA approved vaccines were both RNA vaccines. And the reason that they require freezers are because RNA is so fragile. But they both showed significant protection. And so it proved that this technology is actually very useful. Now, the other question that you should have is, well, are there other ways that one can improve this mRNA kind of vector? And that's actually ongoing. And we will see other vaccines that will use this technology as we kind of move ahead in the other vaccines that are being queued up for approval.
Great, thank you so much. And so, you know, there's always questions about, are they safe? So Kim, maybe we can go over some of this data that we've learned.
Thank you, Joe. Yes. So I think it's important for you to recognize that the development of the mRNA vaccine technology has been building over almost 20 years. It's not like Operation Warp Speed suddenly had the idea to develop an mRNA vaccine. After the SARS epidemic in the early 2000s, companies began to explore the possibility that the mRNA vaccine technology could be a real solution if there were other types of SARS viruses that came on. And so that science was steadily building over more than 15 years. And then COVID hit. And so these companies were just ready to go ahead and use what they've learned to develop this technology. And if you look at the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine, they were given to more than 75,000 subjects before the vaccines were approved for this extraordinary use, both here and in other countries. So it's not like they were tried on 100 people. These vaccines have been tried on 75,000 literally, and the technology is not new. I got my second Pfizer vaccine today, and I have no symptoms. I had no symptoms with the first one, none with the second. None of my patients who've gotten the vaccine have had a significant side effect. And we have data on 75,000 patients to suggest that these are safe. And clearly, if you look at the risk of an infection versus the safety of these vaccines, for me and my patients, it's a no-brainer. I definitely want them to get the vaccine. So I guess that's what I would say to this audience today.
Right, right. You know, and there's been a lot of, you know, things that come up on Facebook and on the internet about, you know, whether this can actually interact with a person's DNA, or whether this vaccine has the risk of causing a disease, you know, and so we know that the mRNA vaccine never enters the nucleus of a cell and does not affect or interact with a person's DNA. And as Enid said, this mRNA vaccine does not contain a live virus. So it doesn't have a risk of causing disease in a vaccinated person. So those are just some other things of why we think that this vaccine is very safe. So let's go on to discuss who should get the COVID vaccine. Enid, do you want to start off with this?
Oh, sure. Basically, everyone should eventually get the COVID vaccine. But to some extent, the recommendations are limited to the current data based on safety issues. So what we know is that anyone 16 years and older who is not on immunosuppressants should definitely get the vaccine. And this is kind of a soft codicil, because for many patients, especially my own patients who are on immunosuppressive drugs, I actually encourage them to get the vaccine, because the issue with immunosuppressants is that you may not generate as robust a response with the vaccine as someone who's not on them. But a partial protection is better than no protection. So for most patients on these drugs, their physicians will encourage them to go ahead and get the vaccine. So the use of vaccinations in children younger than 16 is currently being studied. And so the reason that we are not including children is that we simply don't have all of the data yet. We don't have the data in terms of safety, nor do we have the data in terms of the extent of protection. The Pfizer vaccine is approved for children 16 years and older, and the Moderna vaccine, by contrast, is approved for people 18 years and older. And again, this is dictated by the populations that have been studied in their trials. The important thing is that the benefits greatly outweigh the risks, and there's no preferred vaccine vendor. And so whatever list you get on to receive the vaccine, that is the perfect list that you're supposed to be on. And you can say, well, you hear that one vaccine has 95% protection and maybe another one has 90% protection. Those differences are not meaningful in a pandemic. And the much more important issue is that you get vaccinated. So please don't get carried away with those types of numbers. They're not of great consequence.
Right. So one of the other questions was, do any medications or allergies alter the vaccine's effect? So Enid, you want to?
Oh, sure. There aren't any medications that are known to alter the vaccine's effect, except, as I talked about before, if you're on immunosuppressants. Now, I know that you've heard that these vaccines can occasionally, quite rarely actually, cause an allergic effect. However, the people who are kind of at risk of allergic effects of the vaccines are not those who simply have allergies to medications or allergies to kind of environmental exposure. So patients with those issues still should get the vaccine and they still will be protective. The only people that should have some concern are those who have a history of severe allergic reactions to prior vaccines or injectable therapies. And even then, the recommendation is that they consult with an allergist or first your primary care doctor, who can refer you to an allergist, who will therefore be able to make a recommendation about the vaccine. So for the vast majority of people who have allergies, it's perfectly fine for you to get the vaccine.
Right. So as we discussed, you should get the vaccine that is available to you being either the Pfizer or Moderna. There are other vaccines currently being studied, and as we get information about those vaccines, we will be proactive in getting that information out to you. Now, how do you get on, each state is having its own rollout plan based on government recommendations on who gets the vaccine. So the only way, there is not one way we can say for the whole country. So you need to sign up in your state to get alerts from your county or your state about the phase plans for vaccinations. Many of them are putting together internet sites where you can sign up for an appointment. And as the states get better at distribution and having more distribution sites, there will be more opportunities to sign up for vaccinations. And we also have to wait for those increased doses to come. But everybody will have an opportunity. It may still take some time, but you need to stay on top of it and stay checking with your general practitioner if you have any questions about your eligibility. So I want to go on to some information about COVID testing and how do you detect COVID if you think you have been exposed. So if you have been exposed, you still need to quarantine for about 5 days and then take the test. The test is really not effective to show detection of the virus within those first 5 days. So you will get a negative result in those first 5 days. And as many people know, there are 2 tests, a molecular test, or sometimes called an RT-PCR test. It is very highly accurate, but it takes a longer time to get results. And the antigen tests are those rapid tests. They are accurate, but they're more likely to miss a positive result. And so that's a little bit about in case you need to get testing and if you've gotten exposed, how you should protect yourself and the people that you live with. So to make sure that you're not exposing anybody else. So let's go on to talk about some of the medications that have now been approved to treat COVID-19 when you're in the hospital. Kim, do you want to go over some of these?
I do. Delighted to do that. And again, I guess I would start by reflecting on how much progress we've made in the last 10 months to think about understanding therapies that do potentially have benefit for patients who have COVID-19 and some that don't. And we'll cover the steroid dexamethasone, an antiviral called Remdesivir. We'll talk very briefly about the monoclonal antibodies that are now available, and then a comment or two about convalescent plasma and hydroxychloroquine. This slide illustrates, I think, the key features of the use of dexamethasone, which, as you know, is a steroid. And we know that the COVID-19 virus really revs up inflammation. And it does that particularly in the lungs and can also do that in the kidneys, occasionally also the heart. So the notion that a steroid, which is something that suppresses inflammation, might have benefit makes a lot of sense. And we do think that some individuals with COVID-19, their inflammatory response is too great. It's almost like the level of inflammation that they need to fight the virus is like supersized. And for these people, the use of steroids may really calm that down. So studies have been done, randomized studies comparing a placebo to the drug. And these appear to show that dexamethasone is associated with a lower mortality out at about 4 weeks. And it appears that the patients who benefit the most are the sickest. That is those who already have required supplemental oxygen or they need to be on a ventilator to support their ability to oxygenate. So dexamethasone appears to benefit patients, and it's especially true for those who are the most ill, which is obviously great news for those individuals who are very, very sick when they get into the hospital or become sick later on. Next slide. Remdesivir is an antiviral, and it may slightly improve short-term outcomes in patients who have moderate COVID-19 infection. Studies suggest that this drug given after hospitalization for patients with COVID-19 pneumonia may benefit. It again appears that it's most useful for people who are on the more ill side. They're requiring oxygen, and patients have a quicker recovery compared to patients who don't get remdesivir. And as I mentioned, it's patients on oxygen who may be particularly benefit. The treatment has been compared a 5-day course versus 10-day course, and there does not appear to be a dramatic benefit to giving the drug for a longer period of time. So here are two drugs, dexamethasone and remdesivir, that are currently being used commonly in patients with COVID-19 hospitalized with pneumonia. And the sicker they are, perhaps the more benefit from these agents. The next slide.
It's coming.
Coming soon to a theater near you.
Why isn't it coming?
So I'll simply mention what it shows. Two companies have now developed monoclonal antibodies that are specifically targeting COVID-19. And so this would make all kinds of sense. If we could target an antibody to this virus, it might have a profound effect. And so the studies would suggest that monoclonal antibody therapy may have value in patients with COVID-19, but it's being given earlier. It's being given to patients who might be pre-hospitalization, and they clearly have evidence of COVID infection. It's involving their lungs. They may not yet require hospitalization, and particularly if they have a high-risk condition. For instance, I have a patient who has had a renal transplant, and she developed mild symptoms of COVID. We wanted to get the monoclonal antibody for her to try to prevent progression of her infection that would lead to potentially hospitalization or significant respiratory failure. Another form of therapy that you've heard about in the news is the use of convalescent plasma. So this is the idea that you take the blood from somebody who's had a COVID infection and harvest that blood and give plasma back that has presumed antibody against the virus to help patients who develop COVID-19. So far, the evidence supporting the use of convalescent plasma is not really very strong. There ironically is a study out, I think just today, looking at this, suggesting that if the plasma had higher levels of antibody compared to lower levels, then we might have some benefit. But I would say to you, the jury on the use of on the use of convalescent plasma is still out. It is being tried. It may be useful, but we're not sure. Let's go then to the next slide. You're all familiar with hydroxychloroquine. You know, early on in the infection, there was such fervor for a treatment, anything, that hydroxychloroquine, which is an anti-malarial, entered the mainstream news. And suddenly everybody in the world was thinking about hydroxychloroquine. It's an antibiotic. It's already approved for something else. And there were a couple of early tiny studies, not looking at large groups of patients with COVID, but smaller studies looking at mechanism that raised the question, would this be useful? Subsequently, I think it's very clear, multiple studies, including randomized trials of large groups of people, suggest that hydroxychloroquine does not improve survival in patients with COVID-19. It also does not appear to be preventive of developing a clinical symptom if you get exposed to COVID. And in particular, this is a drug that can affect how the EKG of the heart, how the electrical system of the heart works. And in combination with other antibiotics, it can actually slightly increase the risk of dangerous arrhythmias. So the data on hydroxychloroquine, I think, is clear. It does not have benefit. And in combination with certain other drugs that some of our patients are on, there may be a slight risk of harm. Next slide.
Great, thank you. So now we're ready for just some take-home messages before we start talking about some of the questions that may have come in. So Enid, do you want to just go over this?
Sure. This is probably the most important slide that we have tonight. The first thing is that everyone should be taking those precautions. And I know that everyone is tired. And I know that there's a general sense that maybe some places that we're overdoing it. But the fact is that the most important preventative tool is really the hygienic measures that have been advocated from the beginning. And so now we actually have a battery of masks that we're able to wear. And the only important thing to consider with the mask is that it has at least 3 layers. And you can add a filter to a mask that has a pocket that will do the same thing, or you can actually cut and introduce your filter into a mask that has kind of 2 separate layers. Studies have shown before the implementation of universal masking that COVID-19 positivity was increasing exponentially. And after masking, the positivity decreased linearly. It's easy. It's something that becomes very habituated quickly. So, I mean, please keep the mask and keep using them and make it almost like muscle memory when you put it on. Social distancing. I basically tell my patients that they can use me to explain every social event or encounter that they're going to decline in the next year. And what this means is that you have to avoid those kind of events in which people are going to be close and inside, and there will be more than 10 people. And I think now that there's such a huge number of cases, it's extra important for you to observe the social distancing. And I tell my patients to kind of limit the time that they're in grocery stores, to limit the time that they're in Target, to basically assume that they may be exposed in any location. And so the best way to protect themselves is 1, limit the time, 2, use a mask, and 3, wash your hands, use the sanitizer frequently. And you also should get tested as often as possible. Asymptomatic people can also spread COVID. And definitely before you're going to have even a small gathering, if there's at all a concern that someone may have been exposed or may have been asymptomatically infected, go ahead and get the testing. If you have a critical medical issue that may require hospitalization, you should call 911 or go to an ER. Don't be afraid of hospitals. I mean, I have attended in the hospital several times since the pandemic, and it's a different experience being in the hospital because we all have protective gear on. But please don't fear being in the hospital. The vast majority of the patients who are hospitalized do not have COVID, and they're able to kind of stay in the hospital, get appropriate care, and leave the hospital without COVID infections.
Great, thank you so much. So that's all of our slides for tonight. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it back to Eileen. I see that we have several questions that came in, and we'll be going over those. So let's just.
Thank you. Thank you, Kim and Enid and Joe. That was incredible. There are a lot of questions here. I think there'll be some repeats, but you know, you might have mentioned some of these things, but there's so many questions about them. A lot of these things are worth repeating. Okay, we're going to be going back and forth, I think, between the vaccine and risk factors. So somebody who has Loeys-Dietz type 3, do you recommend him getting the vaccine? Kim, what do you think?
Everybody should get the vaccine when it's available.
Great. So if you're when we're talking about underlying cardiovascular issues, so this is Kim for you too, do you consider the Marfan diagnosis itself as reason enough to be concerned, or only if you have had surgery or taken cardio medicines or higher root dimensions?
So I tried to illustrate that I think simply having a genetic aortic condition or mild aortic valve disease or mild mitral valve disease probably does not represent a real concerning situation. Contrary-wise, if a person has had heart failure from valvular heart disease or has a weak heart or a stiff heart, that's a different situation. It's all about cardiovascular reserve, and much what Enid said, it's about pulmonary reserve as well. So that would be my answer.
Same answer for Loeys-Dietz syndrome and an aortic aneurysm, correct?
Yes, absolutely.
Can you just use the word aortopathy? Can you just say what that is so people understand? I have a question about that.
So many of our audience perhaps have a genetic aortic condition or a family member has it. And it refers to evidence that the aorta is abnormal, often dilated, sometimes so much so that we would call it an aneurysm. But we don't so far think that simply having an abnormal aorta on a genetic basis without another problem like valvular dysfunction that's important or something like that puts patients at a higher risk of a complication from COVID.
Okay, I know you talked about this, but again, these questions are so important, it's worth repeating succinctly. If you have COVID, is it possible that your aorta will grow larger? I guess possible, or have you seen it happen, are two different things, but what have you seen?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We don't have specific data to answer that question. What we do have is Joe sent out to our scientific advisory board, if anybody had seen patients they follow with genetic aortic disease develop expansion or dissection or rupture. None of them reported a patient. I take care of lots of patients with aortopathy. I have not seen a case. And if you look at the large studies of cardiovascular risk and COVID, we've not seen a signal that aortic disease is a big factor in terms of risk. So right now, I'm feeling pretty reassured that this is not a big deal.
Thank you. Okay, are patients with mechanical mitral valves who are on blood thinners at higher risks?
So if a patient who's had a valve repair or replacement has normal cardiovascular function and normal cardiovascular reserve, then the likelihood is they are not at particular risk. Contrary-wise, if, for example, they got their valve fairly late in the course of a problem and they have a weak heart muscle or an extraordinarily stiff heart muscle, then they might be at a higher risk to develop complications with COVID.
Thank you. I just want to remind everybody, I see some people putting their questions in the chat. Please throw them over in the Q&A because I'm going through there. It's hard to look at both places at the same time. Okay, Natalia is asking about PPIs. I don't know what that is. So do PPIs have an impact on one's ability to fight COVID infection? I'm not sure if that's pulmonary or heart.
No, that's okay. I can just take it. Those are proton pump inhibitors, and those are medications that patients use if they have like gastroesophageal reflux or ulcer type disorders. And those have absolutely no effect on the kind of development of COVID or COVID complications, nor do they have effect on the efficacy of the vaccines.
Here's another question for you, Enid. Would you say that those with recurrent pneumothoraces or spontaneous lung collapse, so people with recurrent pneumothoraces, are they at high risk regardless of their age? And is there any data that has given any insight into how important recurrent pneumothoraces are on outcomes?
No, there's not specific data on patients who have kind of recurrent pneumothoraces kind of as kind of a baseline comorbidity. But what we do know is that in a subset of patients who develop COVID, they actually develop pneumothoraces as a complication of having COVID because of the destructive effects of the pneumonia on the lung. And so the rationale behind considering that kind of a high risk diagnosis is the kind of the belief that that reflects kind of chronic damage to the lung and a reduction of their overall kind of pulmonary reserve, which is what I see in most of my patients who have recurrent pneumothoraces.
Thank you. Janet says that she had COVID in April and still has the antibodies, and she wants to get the vaccine, but should she wait to let others who don't have the antibodies get it first? Kim, what do you think?
Well, that's a great question. I think the general notion is that we are going to try to vaccinate people who have had COVID because we're not sure how long the immunity lasts. But I've talked to our leader of our kind of COVID vaccine program here, and he basically indicated that we're not sure. You know, we're just not sure yet what to recommend. So I've been telling my patients who've had COVID, I generally would recommend getting the vaccine when it comes around, but I'm not sure that's the right answer. Enid, what do you think?
I'm recommending that that everyone gets COVID. I think the antibody story is still kind of unresolved. And so we're still not 100% certain of which of the antibodies that people who've had COVID develop are fully protective, which are partially protective, et cetera. So the safest posture is to get the vaccine. And there's no adverse effect of getting the vaccine if you've already had COVID.
Right. So if you've had a tetanus shot recently, how long should you wait before getting the COVID vaccine if it's your turn? Kim? Amy?
Oh boy, that's a good question. I think we're screening a vaccine within 2 weeks, but I'm not sure. Enid, is that accurate?
Yeah, I think waiting 2 to 3 weeks before you get the COVID vaccine would be reasonable. And that's a practice that we have for most vaccines. So I would think that applies to COVID, but that's something I'm going to check to make sure.
I think our program is saying if you've had an allergy shot, you should wait a week. And if you had another type of vaccine, you should wait at least 2 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good question. I haven't heard that one before. So people are stumping me in this Q&A box. They're using acronyms that I haven't heard before. But somebody's asking if they have RAD, would that put them at risk? So what is RAD?
I think they're talking about reactive airways disease, and that's kind of a permutation of kind of asthma. But it's typically what someone would get if they're exposed to a specific agent, and that causes kind of chronic respiratory symptoms. I think if RAD is associated with a diagnosis of chronic asthma or chronic airway sensitivity, reactivity, or whatever, then I think that would place you in a high-risk group if it requires chronic medication. So the diagnosis in itself does not kind of place you in a high-risk group. It's whether you actually require chronic ongoing inhalers or intermittent steroids, or if your RADS is so severe that it's required hospitalization within the last year.
So I'm getting questions by text from people who have the inside line to me here. So, there's been talk of, if you have the vaccine, you may still get the virus, but you're not going to be infected, but you maybe can carry it. So if you've already had COVID and you get the vaccine, and can you still get the virus? You're not going to get infected, and can you transmit it? That's a big story there, but you know what I'm saying?
So I'll go first, and then Enid could tell me if I'm wrong. The best study I know of was the Moderna vaccine study. Not only asked the question, did the vaccine prevent you from getting clinical COVID infection, but did it prevent you from being able to be a positive test?
Right.
And I believe it was a 95% reduction in getting clinical COVID, but about a 75% protection against actually showing a positive test. So there is at least that data to suggest that the vaccine may also prevent us from acquiring and carrying the virus in an asymptomatic form. I don't know about the Pfizer vaccine. Enid, did you know any data there?
No, I don't think the Pfizer study was structured so that they were interested in new infections. And I think for all the vaccines, that's a secondary concern. I think Moderna had that data in a subset. I think that was a subset of their overall cohort where they actually looked at positivity. But I think the safest kind of construction of the data so far is to assume that these vaccines will prevent kind of having a serious manifestation of the infection rather than protecting patients from becoming infected. And the transmissibility is a totally unresolved issue. And so one has to assume that even with the vaccine, they're at some risk of becoming infected, and they're at a probable kind of consistent risk of transmitting it. So that's why we are strongly advocating that even after people are vaccinated, that they continue to use the hygienic practices of wearing the mask, kind of distancing themselves and employing hand hygiene.
I want to just echo that. The data that Joe mentioned, the most recent information we have is that 24% of patients who acquire COVID-19, it's coming from somebody who is asymptomatic and never has symptoms. And about 35% is coming from people who are pre-symptomatic. They have the virus, but they haven't developed symptoms yet. So that over half of the infections that we're seeing globally are being transmitted by people who have no symptoms. And as Enid suggests, the vaccination may not change that until we sort of have herd immunity, a large percentage of the population vaccinated or having survived COVID and is immunized essentially. The ability to relax the social distancing, masking, washing, et cetera, is just not logical.
So then, in other words, the vaccine, what we're doing is people are not going to get as sick. We're going to increase capacity in our hospitals, be able to handle people who need hospitalizations, whether it's for COVID or something else. And then we ourselves won't be getting that sick if we get it, if we even get it with that small percentage. So
I think that's the right answer. I am hopeful that the vaccine will have some effect in reducing the likelihood of a vaccinated person from carrying it. But as Enid pointed out, it's a fairly small sub-study of the Moderna vaccination trial.
We will be watching that. So many questions. Kim, if somebody has aortic dissection right now that they're watching, would that put them at high risk?
So that's a great question. And I guess what I would say is certainly if their aortopathy is thought to be genetic, which we don't think is mainly an inflammatory issue, then my guess is that as long as we're controlling blood pressure, heart rate, et cetera, I doubt that that's a very high risk condition. Now, for a very old person, where we think that atherosclerosis and inflammatory process in the aortic wall may be part of their aortopathy, I could imagine a different answer to that, but we don't have the data.
Okay, great. If some of these medications share receptors with the COVID vaccine, does that mean that there are possible issues with the efficacy of the medications and the vaccine?
We don't think so. This has been studied very, very exhaustively in large sets of individuals. And we don't think that the medications that our audience are on have a serious negative interaction with the COVID-19 virus.
Okay, here we go. Again, some of these are repetitive, but again, such important questions. As someone with COVID-19 right now, I'm wondering if I still need the vaccine. Can you clarify, please?
Enid?
Oh, yeah. If you have an active COVID infection right now, my recommendation would be to continue to quarantine yourself, continue to monitor your symptoms. And then after the acute COVID infection has resolved or run its course, then actually pursue a vaccination. And that's for the reason that we stated that we're not sure what the natural protection is for persons who've had prior COVID infection. And there have been rare reported cases of people developing a second infection after they've already had a prior COVID infection. So it's formally possible. And so to be on the safe side, especially as we're kind of entering kind of months to years after that first infection, it's better to go ahead and get vaccinated.
I think it illustrates the notion that sometimes the viral load that leads to an infection may be smaller. And so the immune response to that viral load may be lower. But if you get exposed again and there's a bigger viral load, the immunity you've got may not be adequate to protect against a larger insult.
Yeah, that sounds reasonable.
I made it up.
Don't say that.
I didn't say that. It's true.
That's a general COVID question, but can one of you speak to neurological issues caused by COVID?
Oh, I could handle that. And COVID can cause a kind of a battery of different neurologic problems. One of the issues that we didn't bring up is the fact that it's very commonly causing kind of what we call a coagulopathy, where you get blood clots in many organs and many sites in the body. And that's why one of the standard practices for patients who are hospitalized with COVID, especially if they require ICU care, is for them to be placed on blood thinning medicines. And so one of the potential complications that we can see are kind of small strokes in patients. We're also seeing kind of permutations of kind of chronic fatigue syndrome, kind of chronic psychiatric decompensations that are associated with COVID. What we're not seeing is we're not seeing a meningitis or encephalitis or specific inflammation of the brain or the spinal cords as part of the spectrum of disease. But I think the stroke syndromes are the manifestations that we're most concerned about. I don't know if Kim has had a different experience with it.
Well, I think you're right. And I think once the sort of the hypercoagulability notion was raised, the use of anticoagulants in a more routine basis for people in the hospital has probably led to a reduction in that phenomenon.
Great, thank you. Kim, are there any concerns about the vaccine response in patients with artificial valves and aortic grafts?
No, not to my knowledge. No concerns whatsoever.
Good, that was easy. Maybe Enid, you want to answer this one. In the UK, there's talk of giving a second dose of the Pfizer vaccine later than intended. For example, instead of 3 weeks later, up to 3 months later. Will this reduce the vaccine's effect in any way?
Probably. I mean, I think the other question that's somewhat related to this is, can you mix and match, kind of start with one vaccine and have the second dose with another vaccine? And the problem with that is that all of our efficacy data is based on very strict protocols. And so our assurance that we're going to have any level of protection that approximates what we're seeing in the trial is based on us adhering to those protocols. So I think it's risky. Will there be some benefit with delaying? There's possibly some benefit, but it's not going to be the ideal or the optimal benefit that one would want to achieve for the patient, and definitely not the kind of benefit that one would want to achieve in order to establish herd immunity.
So let me just add to that. The studies of the mRNA vaccine suggested that the immune benefit was perhaps 60% after a single dose and 95% after a second dose given at sort of that 3 to 4 week interval. I think we can assume that the benefit if the second dose is later probably is somewhere between 60 and 95. And we don't have the data yet to know how close you get to the 95 by having that delayed booster out at 2 or 3 months. Now, the logic in a population point of view is that if you get the vaccine and more arms and you get 60% protection, you might have a major benefit in reducing hospitalizations, ICU care, et cetera, by vaccinating the entire population and getting that benefit. That's not an illogical thought, but it moves us from the science of what the vaccine development looked like to more of a population-based approach with trade-offs. And the trade-offs is basically the people we're vaccinating, we're not giving them the optimal strategy because it hasn't been studied.
It's so interesting to look at it the different ways. And this kind of is in the same vein. So Valerie is saying that so she's in Canada. So since the AstraZeneca vaccine is less effective than Pfizer Moderna vaccines, once it's approved for use in Canada, it may be the only one that she can get. She's not in a priority group. She said she'd be reluctant to emerge from her bubble with 35% chance of not having had an adequate immune response for AstraZeneca. So her question is, would you suggest having antibody tests done after the vaccination to confirm protection? I guess that would hold for for what you're saying too, if you just had one vaccine of.
I have no idea. Ina, what did you think?
I mean, I think that, they had that weird result where they had greater protection at the lower dose than they had at the higher dose, because they had, I think, that dosing issue. I think they worked that out. The AstraZeneca vaccine has not gone through FDA approval here in the United States yet. So I haven't seen the current data. And if it's already approved in Canada, I imagine that they worked out that issue of the dosing in order to achieve optimal efficacy. So I would probably assume that the protocol they're using is kind of yielding a very, very high degree of protection. But, I would like to look into that a little more before I said that with any great degree of certainty.
From what I've seen in non-published data, that early data suggested maybe a 70% protection, and the more recent data up to 90%.
Wow.
And I think this led to Canada, the UK, other countries saying that's good enough. That's good enough. And as you know, the FDA would approve anything better than 50% because the pandemic has us in such a dire strait. So I would get whatever vaccine I could. And I think it's better than 60%.
I do too.
That's good news. Kim, is there any study or information about patients with Marfan who experience COVID-related myocarditis?
So I don't know of any case studies of myocarditis in the Marfan group. And what I would say to you is that the early reports of myocarditis were very isolated case series or case reports. And certainly if you look, so we've cared for, 1,000 or more COVID patients at our hospital. We can count on one hand the number of patients that we really think had myocarditis. It's a pretty rare complication, and it's way less common than serious lung disease and or kidney failure. Enid, what is your experience at Hopkins?
It is decidedly less common than the other organ-specific manifestations. We really have not seen many cases at all of myocarditis.
Us too.
All right, thank you. Enid, regarding the recurrent people with recurrent pneumothorax, is there a threshold that where you say they have compromised lung reserve? I mean, this person said that their son has had four and pleurodesis surgery. So
what I would use to guide that designation are lung function tests. Mm-hmm. So I think anyone, in all of my patients who have recurrent pneumothoraces, I obtain lung function testing because that actually gives you kind of a quantification, a number that you can use in order to determine how much lung function has actually been lost. So I would say that would be the first step. And if you haven't had a lung function test and you've had recurrent pneumothoraces, you definitely should get one. And I would think that whether you fall into the high risk group should largely be dictated by that.
Okay, thank you. Here's a question about somebody who is a non-responder, a vaccine non-responder. It's in the family. The father is a non-responder, 16-year-old son with Loeys-Dietz, based on blood draws. they've had no immune response to previous vaccines. So should they just keep social distancing, mask wearing, all that, and not get the vaccine, or try it?
Well, I think the notion of non-responder includes a whole bunch of things, right? So we have people every year who get a flu vaccine and they get the flu, and it's because they get a different strain than was covered in the vaccine. These mRNA vaccines are developed in such a way that they teach our immunity how to respond to the virus. And so I believe even a non-responder has a very good chance of developing immunity from these vaccines. Enid, does that resonate with you?
I mean, yeah, because I think with the vaccines that have been used, because usually we look for responsiveness based on like a pneumovax or flu vaccines. And there are two things that I would do. I would definitely ask for a consultation with an allergist and someone who can really assess kind of the degree to which someone is a non-responder, because I agree with Kim that basically non-responders typically are not non-responders to every possible vaccine. So I would invite kind of the advice of kind of an allergist, and I would operate on the premise that, you know, that in even partial protection with one of these COVID vaccines is a benefit compared to no protection at all.
Great answer. We keep hearing that if you've had a severe or allergic reaction to a previous vaccine, you should not get the COVID vaccine. How do you characterize a severe allergic reaction? What does that mean?
So I'll start and Enid can finish. This does not include developing a rash or hives. The type of reaction that I think people are more concerned about would be what we call anaphylaxis, where there's a very immediate type of reaction that may be associated with compromise of the airway and or a drop in blood pressure, anaphylactic shock. Somebody who's had such a severe reaction that they need to carry an EpiPen comes to mind. And I think our thinking is those types of individuals should see an allergist to talk about how they can safely get the vaccine. Normally we can get them the vaccine, but it may require a period of pre-treatment with medications that will reduce that chance of a severe reaction. Enid, do you want to add to that?
No, I totally agree, because we typically have a protocol to do what we call desensitize patients so that they don't have the more exuberant reaction to a given vaccine. So yeah, so we're talking really anaphylaxis, and those are people who have severe consequences that often require hospitalization or even kind of ICU management. So it's not just a sore arm, or it's not even the rash or some degree of kind of a low-grade fever. It's a very severe response.
Okay, great. I want to ask this question about VEDS. This is a different question that we've seen so far tonight. Somebody with VEDS who has maybe untreated aneurysms, dissections, has had some replacements, has had some vascular surgery, but have other vascular problems under observation. And you have and this person is saying he's very concerned about having a violent cough with COVID. So can you address that cough and any risks to the vascular system with the fragilities that come with VEDS?
Enid?
Yeah, I guess one question is whether the cough is a residua of the COVID infection, that they had some pneumonia or upper airway issue and now have a cough. And the other part of it is whether the question is whether coughing or having a very kind of severe cough can actually cause kind of vascular kind of trauma.
That's, I think, the second part is, I think, what they're talking about.
I guess theoretically, in very rare circumstances, that could happen, but generally that doesn't happen. But I would say that for anyone who's having that type of cough, they should be on medication to treat the cough. So they should definitely kind of ask their primary care doc, or definitely a pulmonologist, to put them on a medication to treat a post-viral cough. we often see this, and inhalers typically will do the trick. But they need to alert their doctors that they have this residual from the COVID infection.
Yeah, great answer. Kim, does somebody who had open heart surgery at the end of 2020, are they at a higher risk for COVID or for severe COVID response?
So probably not at a high risk for acquiring COVID. And we get back to this notion of cardiovascular reserve, pulmonary reserve. And so if after heart surgery, they have normal heart muscle and they have no evidence of congestive heart failure, then the likelihood is that they're probably not at very high risk of a serious complication. Contrary-wise, if they have a weak heart muscle or they have significant congestive heart failure from a leaking valve or other problem, then they would have less cardiovascular reserve and potentially be at higher risk for a complication.
Okay, thank you. Somebody is asking about the pneumonia vaccine. Their primary care doctor, since they have Marfan, advised them to get the pneumonia vaccine, even though they've never had pneumonia problems. Have you experienced that the pneumonia vaccine is useful in case of COVID infection?
No. So the pneumonia vaccine does not protect the patient from COVID. It protects patients from a certain type of bacterial pneumonia called pneumococcal pneumonia. I think all of my patients who have Marfan syndrome or Loeys-Dietz should have kind of the pneumonia vaccine, as well as the COVID vaccine, as well as the influenza vaccine. So I think they should have all of those vaccines. But unfortunately, there's no real cross protection with these vaccines.
What about a vaccine for somebody who is pregnant? Have they been included in studies at all?
I think that's really an unresolved issue. I think we're waiting for studies or guidelines of what to do with pregnant patients. I don't know, Kim. Are you guys vaccinating pregnant patients now, or?
My recollection is they were excluded from the studies. I think the studies do suggest that if a pregnant woman gets COVID, it doesn't look like it's transmitted to the unborn child, which is wonderful news. But whether it's safe to give a pregnant woman the vaccine, I don't know the answer to that. It's a good question.
We could go on all night here. There's just so many questions. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to. God, I feel so bad. I want to answer more questions here, but I think we need to close it up. And so I just want to tell everybody who sent in questions in the Q&A, we will get these questions to Jan Lynch, our nurse, but give her some time because there's a lot of questions here. So, if you would like to go back over this webinar when you get the recording, because a lot of these questions have been answered. So, but we are going to do whatever we can to get you answers to your questions. So I'm just going to, thank our speakers tonight. Hang out for a minute. I am going to bring back my end slides here. And again, there's Jan. She's a nurse in our Help and Resource Center, and there is the way to submit questions directly to her. Like I said, we'll take the ones from this Q&A box, send them to her. If you have additional questions afterwards or questions not related to this topic, please send them to Jan. Go to marfan.org, ask, and put in your information, and she will certainly get back to you. We also want to remind you that we have more COVID support for you. We have all our information on COVID, recordings of past webinars. The PAB put out a statement. The PAB is our professional advisory board. They put out a statement on vaccines for people with Marfan, Loeys-Dietz, VEDS right before Christmas. That's at marfan.org/COVID-19. We have a special support group on Monday nights that we started in 2020, specifically about coping with COVID stress. And we will send that link to you tomorrow when we send the recording. So you'll be able to sign up for that if you'd like. We also have masks available from the Marfan Foundation, and we'll send that link out to you. Helene might have put that in the chat box tonight, but we want you to stay masked. So you can do that and show your Marfan, Loeys-Dietz, VEDS pride. We have more varieties than you see on the screen here. So support the foundation, wear a mask, it's all good. And finally, we'd like to wish you and your family a happy and healthy 2001. Please listen to the advice given by our amazing panelists tonight. And before we end, I'd like to ask them all if they'd like to say a few words, some closing comments. Enid, you go first.
Yeah, I just want to kind of send my incredibly best wishes to kind of our Marfan and related disorders community. And, you know, and I know how horrible this past year has been, and I know how stressful it's been. And, you know, and I want you to follow our recommendations in terms of keeping yourself safe. But I also want you to think about the ways that you can keep yourself sane and restored and calm and emotionally healthy. So please craft kind of interventions or people or practices that can keep you calm and happy and safe and emotionally healthy. And I'm wishing everybody a wonderful 2021.
Josephine? You're on mute.
Well, just thank you to everybody for participating tonight. I hope that we were able to answer many of your questions. And we really do hope that 2021 is much more healthy and safe, and that we can enjoy each other on a regular basis like we used to. So thanks, everybody.
Kim?
Yeah, I want to just thank you for attending tonight. I wanted also to give a shout out to Jo, who created the slide deck that we used, and she's just an amazing person and resource for the foundation and all of us. You know, there's a couple of things I just want to emphasize before we go. One of them, Josephine mentioned that the testing, if you have COVID, is troublesome, and that is that the tests that we currently have don't turn positive right away after you've been exposed. At day 3, the test is only about 40% positive. And at day 5, when symptoms might be coming, it's only 60% positive. It only gets to about 80 or 90% positive at day 8. So this illustrates the problem we have with what I'll call false negative tests. Our testing technology needs to get better. And also we talked about the fact tonight that many, many of these infections are transmitted by people that are asymptomatic and never, ever get symptoms. So this has created some of the challenges that you've all seen, both locally and also we've seen in our country and globally. But I want to end on a much higher note, and that is if you look at what we've learned in the past 10 months, and if you look at multiple great vaccines that are coming out quickly, and the will of the global community to fight this, I'm very optimistic that we're going to get this behind us in a relatively short order. But we can't drop our guard. We have to stay vigilant and continue to do the things that we know that can reduce the spread. And I hope we'll have a chance to come back to you in 6 months or a year and talk about where we've come. And I'm betting it's going to be much farther than we are today. I'm optimistic, and I wish you good health and safety.
Thank you, Kim. And before I send it over to Michael Weimer to end us off tonight, I want to remind everybody that we have more webinars coming up. We have a webinar next week featuring Rachel Kuchti from Vanderbilt on lens surgery. We have an amazing surgery series weekly in February. We have a personal perspectives panel later this month on how to maximize your doctor visits. So I'll put that all in the email to you tomorrow. You can sign up for some more great offerings from the foundation, all for free, of course, and you know, trying to get you what you need on this journey. So Michael, final words?
Fantastic night, great physicians, great leadership, great community. I think Alessandra from Italy said it best. It's 2:26 in the morning here, but it was worth it. Thank you all very much.
Have a great night.
So long.